All right, Chapter 15, Darwin and Evolution. In this chapter, we're going to cover the first three sections, History of Evolutionary Thought, Darwin's Theory of Evolution, and Evidence for Evolution. So we're going to start off by talking about the history of evolutionary thought. Prior to the work and observations of Charles Darwin, it was generally believed that species had remained unchanged since the beginning of time. It was the observation of geological formations and species variation that led Darwin to propose the idea of evolution via natural selection. Darwin's initial findings have been the basis for our current understanding of evolution, the unifying principle of biology. This just means that this theory can be used to explain both the unity and the diversity of life, in that all things are descended from a common ancestor. Those species that are similar are recently descended from a common ancestor, and those species that are dissimilar are more distantly descended from common ancestors. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck was the first biologist to offer a testable hypothesis to explain the variation in species via adaptation to the environment. Lamarck studied the fossilized life forms that were found in the Earth's strata, and he was the first to propose that complex organisms were descended from simpler life forms. He believed that this was due to a motivation life force, essentially meaning that organisms change themselves to better adapt to their surrounding environment. It's sort of like saying that the adaptation was a choice, whether it was conscious or unconscious. He proposed the idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, the idea that the environment produces physical changes in an organism during its lifetime that are inheritable. His most famous example of this was the idea of the long-necked giraffes that developed over time because their necks grew longer as they stretched to reach food in tall trees. This long neck was then passed on to future generations. This theory was never supported by experimentation, and phenotypic changes during a person's life are not going to be found within the genotypes of the individual's offspring. Malthus was also a huge contributor to Darwin's ideas about the inheritance of characteristics or natural selection. Malthus was an economist that studied the factors that influence the growth and decline of human populations. In 1798, he published an essay on the principles of population, in which he proposed that the size of human populations is limited only by the quantity of resources, such as food, water, shelter, that are available to support it. He related famine, war, and epidemics to the problem of populations overstretching their limited resources. Darwin, after reading Malthus's essays, applied similar principles to animal populations. So the idea was that animals produce more offspring than can survive, and competition for limited resources in the environment is the element that determines survival, or the idea of natural selection. So here's just sort of a side-by-side diagram showing some of these competing theories. Lamarck's theory was that early giraffes probably had short necks, so they stretched up to reach for food. And so because they stretched their necks, their offspring were born with slightly longer necks. So their offspring had longer necks that stretched to reach the food, and as they stretched their necks, their offspring were born with longer necks. And eventually the continued stretching of the neck led to today's giraffe. Like, that sounds well and good, but if you think about it logically at all, that's kind of like saying if you broke your leg, then all of your children would be born with broken legs. Or if you cut your hair, or shaved your head, your children would be born bald or with short hair. It's not true. Things that happen to your somatic cells in no way affect your offspring. Really, at least in terms of genetics, only mutations that happen to gametes have the ability to be passed down from one generation to the next. Mutations in your somatic cells aren't going to be passed down, and phenotypic changes aren't going to be passed down either. But keep in mind, all of this was done many, many, many years before we really even understood genetics, or we had any concept of the cell, or how characteristics or inheritance is passed down from one generation to the next. So it's not a bad idea. I mean, it's horribly wrong, but it's not a bad idea. But yes, just any sort of logical thought process should tell you that things that happen during a person's lifespan aren't necessarily going to be passed down to future generations. Darwin's theory, on the other hand, functions a little bit differently. His theory was that early giraffes probably had necks of various lengths. Some were short, some were tall. And natural selection due to competition meant that the longer neck giraffes were able to get more food, they were able to forage better, so they survived when the shorter neck giraffes did not. Because they had longer necks and they survived, they were able to pass their longer necks on to the next generation of giraffe. And there was more in variability. Some had really long necks, some had shorter necks, some had, average size necks, but the really long necks in every generation continued to survive and reproduce to produce a taller and taller generation. So that's sort of the main difference between Lamarck and Darwin in their theories of evolution.